I'm inside the computer, man. This is awesome. I want to scan the entire shop. Ooh. Whoa. Ah. Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today, we're gonna solve the one and only problem I can find with the PSVR2. Usually, when we make project videos, we jump right into showing you the design, showing you how we're gonna build the thing, but I think there's a lot of stuff that gets skipped there because we do all that work beforehand. So today, even though we have a thing that we're going to build, I would like to take some time to talk about how I think about design, how I end up at the solution that we end up building. Obviously, this process is different for everybody, so my way is not the only way, but I wanted to give you some insight. We have to think about three big things as we go into designing a solution for something. Who is the consumer is one really big thing. What functions does your object need to perform, and how do you want it to look? So let's go through those one at a time. So the first thing you gotta do is figure out who the consumer is. This isn't necessarily a customer. I mean, it might be if you're selling something. In this case, I'm the consumer because I'm making this for me to hold something that I bought in my cabinet. But usually you have to think about who that consumer is, what makes them unique, how do you build something specifically to solve a problem for them, and you want to make sure that you're not creating work in your solution for the consumer to do. But like I said, in this case, I'm the consumer. So even though I know what I want, I still need to define it to make sure that I can meet those goals. The whole point is to store the PlayStation VR controllers and their charger, plus the headset. And so we have to think about a few things in regard to that. This headset has a cable, so we have to be able to store the cable and the headset, as well as this holder and the controllers. This holder also gets plugged in, so we have to have a way to get power to it. So in my case, we've got all of our game systems in a cabinet here. There's no room in here to put this whole new setup. So in the cabinet next to it, where we have a bunch of other stuff just kind of thrown in, what I want to do is actually build a holder that's going to mount to the back wall that can hold both of these things that we're trying to design for. But in addition to that, I want this holder to also work sitting on a surface. Another consideration in this case, because I'm fitting it into this area, I want this thing to be as small as possible. The next thing to think about is what you want it to look like, what the aesthetic of the object needs to be. And in this case, if we were trying to show off the holder, we would probably want to try to match the aesthetic of the headset itself. Matte white, black, plain and smooth. But like I mentioned before, we're actually trying to make this thing disappear. We don't want to see it any more than possible, so it's not a huge concern. But we can take cues from a simple kind of black and kind of white would be a good way to make it disappear within the headset even more. So we've defined the three things. Who the consumer is, it's me. What we want the thing to do, we listed all those out, and what we want it to look like, which is basically nothing. Next step is to start to sketch it out and actually figure out as much of the idea as you can on paper before you start doing anything, because a lot of times you can solve a lot of problems just on a piece of paper. So I've got this cool notebook that we actually sell on our website, but it's graph paper. I like to work in graph paper because in case I need that graph to help sketch something, I've got it. This is a great place to start. But since we're making a video, and this might be hard for you to see, let's go to the whiteboard. So here's what I want to do with this. I want to make a simple shelf that this can sit on, and then I want this to kind of nestle over it and get as close as possible and be held in kind of that orientation. That's going to compress these two things together as much as I possibly can. So we're going to have a back and a bottom section. We need to have a strong joint here. And then on this surface, we're going to have the charger is going to sit right about here. We want the headset to come down right here. We need something back here for the back of the headset to sit on, and then some sort of a front piece to come up for the front of the headset. It needs to rest in these two places, but we have to think about a few things. One, the material that's touching these things. There's a lot of padding on this headset, and we want to make sure that we're not putting too much stress in one place on the padding so we don't get a little divot that's just going to stay there forever. So we might have to spread this connection point out around the front and the back of the headset. So what we should do is take some measurements of the actual items and then start to apply those measurements here so we can use some different prototype methods to make these pieces and start to iterate through this. I got the most basic measurements possible. It's really just the outer bounds of these objects, except for the kind of distance between the contact points of the headset. That's what I care about on that particular piece. The whole idea of building a prototype is to do the first step in something. You're not trying to start out by making the final product, right? So you want to use materials that are easy to work with, that are inexpensive, because you know that your first iteration is probably not going to be the final one. So I've got a bunch of different things that I've used over the years to build out physical things that are very inexpensive. So let's go through a few of them so you have some ideas. Popsicle sticks or tongue depressors are fantastic. This doesn't work in every situation if you need a big flat piece of material, but for connecting things, you can glue these together, you can break them, you can cut them very easily. And then bamboo skewers are another great way to kind of poke through, connect things together. They can simulate a rod that would later be turned into a piece of steel or a piece of aluminum, something like that. So these are great, simple things to start with. And on top of that, you have some big surfaces that you want to work with. Cardboard is a fantastic one. And what I often do is I'll cut down an Amazon box from an order that I get and keep the big pieces around for stuff just like this. These were actually things that I had for a long time, and I put them in the recycling a couple of days ago before we decided to make this video. So I grabbed them out to use them for this specifically. Cardboard is fantastic. Another similar option is Coroplast. This is a corrugated plastic sheet. These are used for signage and stuff. It's a really cheap way to have a material that you can both bend, but you can keep a rigid surface. You can hot glue it together. It's easy to cut with a utility knife. The stuff's pretty great. In addition to that, you've got foam board, and this is kind of like a foam core with paper on the outside. You can get it in a bunch of different colors, but it has just enough rigidity to it that you can actually build a simple structure out of it. It's also easy to cut and easy to glue together. Past that, you have things like styrene. This is just a plastic sheet of styrene material. This is very, very thin, and you can get it in all different thicknesses. This stuff is very easy to bend. You can use heat to shape it. And this is actually the material that I would use in a vacuum former probably to copy a shape. We're gonna start with cardboard because I have a lot of it and it's easy to see on camera. So basically I'm just gonna start by laying a piece out, getting the elements laid out on top of it and start to trace that. The bottom section is actually gonna be really easy. The back section is gonna be even easier. The difficult thing here, or the part that has to be specific, is the part that holds the headset, the front and the back little ledges. So we'll get the first base plate down and then we can always come back and refine that shape, but let's just get the maximum dimensions first. We have to build up these shapes where the headset's gonna rest. And since I don't know the final material, I don't know if it's gonna be 1/2 inch plywood or 3/4 inch plywood or something else. So we're just gonna use the cardboard again, cut it into pieces and laminate it together to build up a shelf here. And then later on, we can decide what material to turn that into when we get to that point. All right, this is prototype 1. Obviously it's not very refined, but we need to see if these things work, if they do the job. So let's just fit this all together and see how it looks. This needs to go pretty much right up against that edge. We may have to move it forward and backward a little bit. Let's see if these work. Okay, it does work, but I already see a couple of problems. One, there is nothing stopping the headset from moving. So if I were to push like this, it's gonna start to fall off the front edge. Nothing hooks it back here, so we need to make sure that those surfaces that they're sitting on kind of go up into the headset, so it's gonna have something retaining it in both directions. So that's one thing, that's a pretty easy adjustment. I also see that the front is probably a little bit low. It could be lifted up a little bit so that we have clearance here and the parts don't touch. But overall, I think we have a pretty good first attempt. Okay, so this is another idea that I just had. Maybe instead of the front of this sitting directly on top of something, it actually has a little ledge that the front edge sits in. That's gonna push the connection point all the way up here to a more rigid corner, which will be good, and it will stop it from being able to fall forward. It's just gonna change the way that this looks a little bit, but let's try it out. I'm gonna make a little offset tool here. Well, we only care about the bottom, so let's cut it off about there. And if I carve out a little notch in there, yeah, I mean, I've ended up getting rid of most of the shape, so it doesn't really help that much, but I have the general idea of what I need to do. So that point, that high point is the corner. And so now what I can do is just use that point and measure this distance and this distance and start to make a shape that will just contact right there. It's the next day, and as you can see by all of this cardboard scrap, I've worked on trying to figure out a good way to nestle the front of the headset into some sort of a ledge. And so once I got this profile, I was able to lay it down on some other cardboard and cut out a few more of these to make it thicker. And then I put that in place and realized that I actually want to distribute the load of the headset across more surface. So basically we're going to get rid of this whole thing. And I ended up with that same shape, and I made 2 of these that are this thick so that I could line them up, kind of fan them out a little bit, and that will give the front of this a place to sit. So I'm gonna have 2 of these that are gonna kind of cradle it from each side. That does 2 things. It stops it from being able to move back and forth because it's nestled, but also it stops it from wanting to tip over from side to side as much as it would if there were a single point right in the middle. So now that I've got these, I just have to modify my bottom plate to accept the new length. And so I'm gonna make another bottom piece that's similar to this. And then I think we'll be at a point where we can start to translate this into wood. Okay, with that, prototype 1 or 2, A or B, I don't know which version this is, but this one is finished. And it still has a long way to go, but I think we need to take a break before we move ahead and change materials and make sure that it's actually accomplishing all the tasks that we set out in the beginning. I am still the consumer, so I have to like what this is gonna do and how it's gonna look and all that stuff. So we went through the list of needs, and one of those things was that it needs to hang on the wall. It currently can't do that because we don't have anything back here, but that's an easy addition that we're definitely going to add into the next one. It wouldn't do us any good to make that out of cardboard anyway. We also wanted the headset to be held in place and not fall off, and I feel like we've done that. You would have to work pretty hard to get this to fall off in any direction. I think it's going to be plenty stable, so we can check that one off. Another thing was that we wanted the charger to be able to be plugged in. There's enough of a gap here behind it that we can easily drill a hole, feed the wire through, and plug in the chargers. So I think that one is checked off as well. Another big one for me was that it is as compact as possible, and I feel like we've minimized the shape. I'm not sure that we could get it any smaller, so for now, I'm gonna say that that one's good to go. The only other big thing was that it's repeatable. Eventually, I want this to be able to be made into a set of plans or templates or manufactured, and right now, as it stands with these materials, that is not the case, so we don't have that one yet. But I think it's at a point where we can replicate this in wood and see if that will solve any of those outstanding problems. So my attempt here was just to replicate this into a piece of wood so I could kind of see how the materials would affect it. I got to this section and realized that by adding the back section here, there's another little problem, but it actually helped me come up with a solution. Let's go to the whiteboard, I'll show you what I'm talking about. So the original idea was to have this ledge coming up from the bottom where the headset rests, and then a separate piece for the back wall. But as I was starting to place those out in the wood prototype, I realized that they're like 2 inches apart, and I would have to fill all of that space with some material so that I could have a strong enough joint in the corner to carry the weight of the entire thing. So we can completely get around that by just focusing on this surface. It doesn't need to come from the bottom, it can come from this back wall. So instead of that, we're actually just going to have a shelf piece that comes off the back wall that gives us this entire corner to come up with good, strong joinery. So now that that's all I have to worry about, I can actually add finger joints down here, and that will be a very, very strong joint with lots of glue and everything, and I won't have to add any fasteners, which will simplify the entire thing. Then I just have to have the little shelf that comes off here to hold the back of the headset. These pieces, I tried to thicken them up, and they are way too thick, so 2 would be more than enough and would not touch the lenses. So that cuts it down to a 1-inch material. If I took it down to 3/4, then it could be a single piece, still connected at 2 points. That's probably the way to do it. That's better. With that simple addition, I think this version of the prototype is done, the wood version. So we have to make sure that it checks off all of our criteria. The 2 things that were outstanding were that it could be hung on the wall, so we can check that one off. The other thing is manufacturability. Now that it's 1/2-inch material, it's all made of 1/2-inch, theoretically we could laser cut or CNC cut or cut on a table saw to make these pieces. So I'll say that one's kind of checked off. So after that, after you get a solid prototype, one that checks all the boxes that you have, next you can move on to continuing to improve it, but also making it look the way that you want it to look. As we look at this right now, we see that there's a whole lot of extra material. More material means it's more expensive, means it's harder to make and sell. And so we can minimize the footprint for sure by changing some of the shape. But also looking at this front section, we don't really need all of this thickness. The place that we need thickness is actually up here where it contacts the headset. So another idea for this section would be to make a T, flat surface that the headset sits on, and then that T has a single point that goes down to our base plate. So we can definitely make some improvements here. There's definitely a lot of changes that we can make, but I think the first big thing is to cut down material and make it as minimal as possible. Now I'm trying to figure out the kind of outside profile of it. I sketched with a pencil, but after a while that gets hard to follow with your eyes. One thing I like to do with curves is using this thin tape. This is for pinstripers, people who put pinstriping on vehicles and stuff. And it's a masking tape, but it's thin enough that you can kind of bend it and get nice big curves. So with the curve, obviously I'm doing this by hand and I made a template to do the other side, so they're not exact, but they're similar. And when it comes to the manufacturability of this, what I would end up doing is take a picture of one of these curves, take it into CAD so that it could be mirrored on the other side. We've got duplicate lines, and then if we go to cut this on a laser or a CNC, it's gonna be a perfect match between the two sides. So we're at a point now where it's functionally doing exactly what it needs to do. I do think it's as minimal as possible. So if I wanted it to be laser cuttable, then I probably have to stick to 1/4 inch material, which means I would have to double up a lot of surfaces, which means I would then have to end up finishing those surfaces so that they didn't look like stacked pieces of wood. I'm just gonna take that off the table. That's not something I wanna do. The next thing would be, is this gonna be 100% CNC'd? I could use 1/2 inch MDF. It'd be easy to cut all of these different pieces, but it does lock you into being able to assemble those pieces together, which means you have to be able to cut the pieces for assembly, which means that we're gonna end up with stuff like this, and that's our only option. The other thing would be 100% 3D printed, but there's a huge surface on the bottom, there's a big surface on the back, there's no reason to 3D print those. And then I have to go back to who's the consumer. I want this to look a certain way in my house, so I have to think about the best way to do that. And I think for me, it's gonna be a combination. That combination means I want all of this to be CNCable with 1/2 inch material, except for this part right here. I don't think this looks as good as I want it to look, and I think a way to make it look better would be to 3D model it. I can get functionally the same thing, but make it follow the curves better, make it smooth, add some adornments to the front of it if I want to, and I can make it so that it plugs into a hole that I CNC into this bottom surface. If I decide to sell these, I can flat pack all of the bottom and the back pieces and then just 3D print these pieces to insert, and somebody could buy the kit. So I'm gonna head to Fusion 360 and figure out how to model this. After about maybe 30-45 minutes of modeling, I ended up with a shape to replace this piece of wood. The point of this is to have the right profile there for the front of the headset to sit on. It looks better from the front, and it has some pins that stick out the bottom so it can go into holes that I have yet to drill into the surface. Once I got done with this one, I realized that the back piece actually looked pretty terrible. So I went on modeling a piece to fit there. It's the same kind of ledge, has the correct profile, and has holes in the back for the same size pins as the front. So on the new version of this, I'm just gonna have to drill some holes and use some dowels so that I can put these things in. I think you would probably want to CNC a pocket in for the base of this charger so that it's not free to move around. It needs to be able to set in, even if it's just a little bit, to kind of lock it into its position. And I think we could probably change the shape of the back panel just a little bit. I actually really like where this is going now. I think I'm pretty close to what I'm going to say is my final version. This entire time, we've been checking off the list of the things that this needed to accomplish. At the very beginning, we defined who the consumer was, that's me. We defined all the things that this needed to do, and I think we've checked all of those boxes. Along the way, I was able to figure this thing out a piece at a time with cheap materials, and now I have it in front of me and I don't have to wait on some other company to make it. One of the coolest things about this is that it is very minimal, it works with the design of the headset, and it'll work on a tabletop or mounted to the wall. We're gonna have all the files available for this thing if you wanna print and cut your own. That'll be on the website. The link will be down in the description. You can go check that out. So now that I've got this problem solved, I've got video games to play. Thanks for watching. Now it's time for bloopers. Hey, So really it's just about what I want, but I do need to How do you use this thing? Surface and this surface. But the distance between this, that will work.